So I want to welcome all of you here to great cities. You know, it's become a truism that Americans will require increasing amounts of formal education to become prepared for the jobs of the future. Is this truism true? Howard Wial will examine the changes in the workforce, jobs and education and training needs that are likely to occur here in Illinois over the course of the next decade. He will, in addition, talk about the implications of these changes for workforce policy. We're very pleased that Howard is director of the Center for Urban and Economic Development, a very long-standing, very important center here at UIC. It's always been a model for connecting research on economic issues with the various policy needs. Before joining us here at UIC, Howard was a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. His research currently focuses on manufacturing and urban and regional economic development. We very much appreciate that he's here, bringing with him his background and his PhD in economics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and his Juris Doctor from Yale Law School. Howard, we so appreciate that you're here, and we thank you for your time.
Thanks, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to use the Illinois workforce and workforce policy over the course of the next decade as a prism for examining two pieces of what has become conventional wisdom. That the workforce is becoming more diverse demographically. We're going to be we're going to have a much more diverse work environment in the future. And the second, as Teresa mentioned, is that workers don't have enough skill or formal education to meet the needs of the jobs of the future. And in brief, this examination will support the first piece of conventional wisdom and take issue with the second. And if you want to leave now, I think we're at the big bottom line. I guess you can, otherwise you can stick around and hear the details. So, we hear a lot about skill shortages. Is there really one? Well, our mayor thinks so, and he's not the only one. In an interview with Tom Friedman in the New York Times Magazine from a couple of years ago, Friedman quotes the mayor as saying that on a bad day he finds himself staring right into the whites of the eyes of the skill shortage. Doesn't say whether the skill shortage stared back. And then he quotes the mayor as saying, I had two young CEOs in the healthcare software business in the other day sitting at this table. I asked them, what can I do to help you? They said, we have 50 job openings today and we can't find people. The assertions about skill shortages are most pervasive perhaps in manufacturing, and whenever I talk to small and medium-sized manufacturers or the organizations that represent them or work with them, the first thing that I hear from them is that they can't find the workers that they need. But here, even the CEO of Caterpillar, a much bigger company, says we can't find qualified hourly production people, and for that matter, many technical engineering service technicians and even welders, and it is hurting our manufacturing base in the United States. The education system in the United States basically has failed them, and we have to retrain every person we hire. Well, if things are really that bad, if we take these assertions at face value, then as an economist, I would expect to see wages going up as employers bid up the pay of these extremely valuable workers that they have a hard time finding. But here we see that in Illinois, and the picture is not that much different nationally, exactly the opposite has occurred. If we look at inflation-adjusted median wages by education group, we find that the median wage for every one of these four education groups, less than high school, some college, and a bachelor's degree or higher, is lower in 2012 than it was in 2000. And the bachelor's or higher combines people who just have bachelor's degrees and people who have graduate degrees. It turns out, based on national data, and there's really no reason to think that Illinois is a whole lot different here, that if you have a graduate degree, your inflation-adjusted pay actually went up slightly since 2000. People with only bachelor's degrees, of course, who dominate that bachelor's degree or a higher category, their pay has been going down. So if you think that education is a way to avoid declines in your real wage, unless you get a graduate degree, that's probably not true. A metaphor, a simile that I've sometimes used, although it gets me in trouble with education advocates, is that thinking that we can raise wages in this country by pursuing more and more education, at least only by pursuing more and more education, is like thinking that you can avoid the consequences of a sinking ship by climbing to the top decks. So that's, I think, what this shows. Now you might think, well, all that is true of wages, and that's not good news, but wages aren't all of compensation. There are also health benefits and pensions, and health benefits in particular are pretty expensive, and their costs haven't risen in the last year or so. They have been rising earlier, so maybe that's the problem. But we see here that total hourly compensation, measured in two different ways that the federal government has for measuring it, these are two different indices, has been just about flat since about 2003. Meanwhile, productivity, the amount of goods and services produced in the U.S. economy per hour worked, has continued to go up. The divergence between productivity and compensation has really been especially stark during this past decade or so. Up through about the mid-1980s, productivity and compensation moved very, very closely together. Working people got the benefits of productivity growth just as much as anybody else did. Then, from about the mid-80s to the beginning of the 2000s, compensation went up, productivity went up, but compensation went up more slowly than productivity. Workers were still getting the benefit of productivity growth, but clearly others were getting more of the benefit of productivity growth. And now, since the beginning of the last decade, compensation hasn't really changed much. Productivity has continued to go up. Who's getting the benefit? It's not working people. Meanwhile, a familiar story, but one that always needs to be retold, wage inequality has been growing. Here we look at the 90th, 10th, and 50th percentiles of wages in Illinois. 90th percentile, high wage workers, people who make less than 10% of workers, more than 90%. Well, in general, their pay has gone up since 2000. Low and medium wage workers, though, their pay has stagnated and declined. The median has stagnated and then declined even more than the 10th percentile has. So with that as background, I want to shift to a description and prediction mode, and look at what the Illinois workforce is going to look like in the next decade, what the jobs are going to look like, and what kinds of education and training will be needed. And at the end of this, we'll circle back to the issue of whether there's a skill shortage, and then move on to talk about policy. So, what will the Illinois workforce look like in the next decade? Well, we did some projections. We based them on the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity population projections, which are done by demographic group. They were done shortly before 2010, probably in about 2009, for the period 2010 to 2020. So we basically combined their demographic population projections for 2020 with labor force participation rates from the current population survey as they exist right now in 2012. And in doing that, we are basically assuming that the current labor force participation rates, which are historically very, very low because of the recession and the slow recovery from the recession, will persist into the future. Basically, I'm assuming that the economic recovery is going to continue at a very, very slow rate, similar to what it has, what it's been like over the last few years. We're not going to have a rapid recovery. If we did have a rapid recovery, then this would all change. So if you think that we're in for a more rapid recovery than I do, then you're going to have a more optimistic view than you'll see in these projections. So one thing that the Illinois workforce is going to be in 2020 compared to today is it's generally going to be older. If you compare the blue bars, which are 2012, with the red bars, which are the projections for 2020, we see there are going to be smaller proportions of the workforce age 24 and under, larger proportions ages 25 to 39, smaller proportions ages 40 to 54, and then bigger proportions for the oldest age groups, ages 55 and up, and much bigger proportions, ages 60 to 64 and 65 plus. Most of these changes really are pretty tiny, and that's really what you expect over such a short period of time when you're talking about a state as big as Illinois. Looking at these changes over an 8-year period is basically like filling up a large bathtub with water. And if the water starts out cold, and even if you put in very, very hot water, it's going to take a while for the whole bathtub to warm up in any substantial way. So that's why we're typically seeing pretty small changes between now and 2020. So it's in that context that you should look at these 60 to 64 and 65 plus changes. You can see a change from about 5% of the workforce being 65 and up in 2012 to about 6% in 2020. That's an enormous change for such a short time. And you'll see similar things going on, similarly very small changes for other demographic features of the workforce, such as gender. The workforce will become slightly more female, from 46.2% in 2012 to 46.4% in 2020. And be more racially diverse, a little bit less white, actually considerably less white, about 4 percentage points less white, and a little bit less black, 0.4 percentage point less black, more Asian and more people of other races. So the diversity point seems to be correct. And here's another aspect of diversity. It also seems to be growing. The labor force will be considerably more Hispanic, from 12.9 to 14.3%. That's a pretty big jump in a fairly short time. Immigrant, also, the immigrant share of the labor force is going to go up a bit. And finally, educational attainment. Well, the workforce is going to become better educated in terms of formal education. The percentage of the workforce with less than high school, just high school, some college, and even associate degrees will go down a little bit. The percentages who are college graduates with bachelor's degrees and with higher degrees will go up. So the workforce is becoming better educated. However, even as that happens, the vast majority of workers will not have a college degree of any kind. And here we see the geography of the workforce. We're looking at projected percent changes in the workforce in each region of the state. And basically the expanded Chicago area, basically the Illinois part of the Chicago metropolitan area plus Kankakee County, and I think that there's another county a little south of that that's included here, is going to grow pretty robustly, and after that, the Rockford area, and then growth in the workforce really tapers off a lot. There's some in the central part of the state and the far south, but the western part and the near south are hardly going to grow at all. So overall, the workforce is going to be more concentrated up here than it already is. About 2/3 of the workforce is now in the state, is now in the Chicago area. So what about the jobs? Well, there's expected to be growth in both high and low skill service jobs. That's probably the biggest message. Here we look at projections from the Illinois Department of Employment Security, which are done in cooperation with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Every state does these, they all use the same methodology. So if we just look at major industry groupings, there are 3 major industry groups that are projected to grow rapidly from 2010 to 2020. We couldn't include 2012 because the data are classified in ways that aren't quite comparable. Professional and business services, leisure and hospitality, education and health services. What's declining? Well, information. You might be surprised at that if you think of information primarily in terms of the internet and software, but remember that a lot of the jobs in information are in print media, like newspapers, and those have been declining pretty rapidly and probably will continue to. Agricultural production, utilities, and manufacturing. Now, I don't agree with this particular aspect of the projection. I'm not sure that IDES would agree with it now, but remember, these were projections from 2010 to 2020 that were done really starting around 2008, based on information that was available at that time and expectations that the IDES and BLS economists had at that time. So I'm not sure that even they would agree that manufacturing is going to decline. Beginning at the beginning of 2010, the number of manufacturing jobs has grown nationwide, and it's grown a little bit faster in Illinois than it's grown nationwide. And I think that will continue. Why I think it will continue, Randy Blankenhorn touched on this yesterday, so I'll just go through it quickly. China and other low-wage countries are seeing labor costs go up because wages are going up. They're probably going up faster than productivity. The value of the Chinese yuan, though it's still manipulated, is going up a little bit. Just-in-time delivery is as important, more important than it ever was before. So if you need to serve customers in the United States, it becomes more important to manufacture in the United States. Increasingly, big multinational manufacturers are becoming aware that there are costs to offshoring, that the wage benefits, labor cost benefits of offshoring are not all there is to offshoring. There are coordination costs that are pretty substantial. There are costs of managing far-flung supply chains. There are transportation costs that are not trivial. And while the consulting firms that marketed offshoring to these companies back in the early part of the 2000s didn't think about those costs very much back at that time, they are now making a good living marketing reshoring to the very same companies to whom they previously marketed offshoring. They're now saying, well, wait a second, we can help you figure out whether it really makes sense to continue to locate production in China, or whether it would make more sense to bring some production back here to the US. So the consultants went out every time. Companies were also recognizing the importance of co-locating production and R&D. The idea that R&D can just be done first before production and then hand it off and translate it into a kind of routinized production that doesn't then feed back into R&D has never been the way that R&D and production relate to each other, and the companies and top managers are increasingly realizing that too. On the other hand, we're probably going to see slow growth of manufacturing jobs. I don't think we're going to see a major renaissance of manufacturing jobs in the state or the region or the country, absent much bigger public policy interventions than we're likely to see in the near future. Why is it going to be slow? Well, our major trading partners have had economic recoveries that are just about as weak as ours, in some cases weaker. So that means a slow recovery of demand for our manufactured exports. And historically, as economic recoveries proceed, manufacturing job gain is slow. Manufacturing has tended to lead economic recoveries. That's true in this economic recovery. It used to be true in the early 80s and all the earlier economic recoveries going back to World War II. It's to be expected. So I imagine that you will start to see news reports saying that the manufacturing moment has passed because manufacturing isn't growing as fast in the future as it was in the last couple of years. I don't think that means that manufacturing's moment has passed. It may mean that manufacturing's political moment has passed, but I don't think it means that manufacturing's economic moment has passed at all. Even when times were better for manufacturing, that's just the way manufacturing recovered in relation to the rest of the economy. If we look at more detailed industries, what's going to grow quickly? Well, these lessers of non-financial intangible assets, which are the biggest percentage growth, that's a little bit misleading because it's off a very small base. It also reflects the growing importance of intellectual property. That is, companies and people who license patents and copyrights and trademarks and similar things like that. Internet services, data processing services are projected to grow pretty strongly, warehousing and storage also, and a variety of other professional service jobs too. What's going to decline? Well, if you take out the manufacturing industries, which really dominate IDES's list of declining industries, but which, as I said, I don't really believe, basically there's a whole bunch of industries that are projected to decline. One theme that's common to many of them is that industries that are faced with internet competition are going to be declining industries, so publishing other than internet. Clothing stores, sporting goods, hobby, book, and music stores tremendously displaced by internet sales. Even food and beverage stores to some extent, and non-store retailers like catalog sellers and similar kinds of retailers, infomercials, newspaper delivery, things like that, and insurance carriers, which to some extent face competition from internet-based businesses. If we look at occupations, well, there's going to be strong demand for a range of major service occupations, computer and math, many different kinds of healthcare, education, training, and library. What's going to decline? Farming, forestry, and fishing. They say production, but that's basically because they think manufacturing is going to decline. As I said, I don't think that's true. If we look at more detailed occupations, we see that this list of fast-growing occupations is dominated by many healthcare-related occupations, many different kinds, from biomedical engineers to home healthcare aides, personal and home care aides, skin care specialists, medical scientists, and several other groups. So if you're going to school on the West Campus, I don't know if anyone here is, I didn't think you were, then you may be in somewhat better shape than if you're going to school over here. What occupations are going to decline the most rapidly? Basically, many different kinds, but occupations that can be replaced by a computer probably will be. So you see various occupations that are related to publishing down at the very, very bottom. You also see switchboard operators, printing workers, reporters and correspondents, and a couple of postal service occupations. All of those are projected to lose jobs. Now, I don't want to sound too technologically determinist here. For example, when you look at the Postal Service, other companies have managed to allow or force or induce their postal services to go into lines of business that have been expanding. The U.S. Postal Service is not allowed to do that because our politicians fear that it will go into competition with private delivery services and take their business away. So there are alternative ways to respond to technological change, and these projections reflect the likely way that Illinois and the United States will respond. So, what are jobs going to look like in terms of their education and training and experience requirements? Well, they're increasingly going to require either very high or very low levels of formal education. If you look at the high school and if you look at less than high school, there's a small increase in the share of jobs that are going to require that amount of education. There are also small increases in the shares of jobs that are going to require a bachelor's degree, a graduate or professional degree, and even an associate degree. The in-between categories really don't change much, if at all. High school diploma itself, that's going down a little bit in percentage terms. So generally, polarization of education requirements, but very, very small. And once again, most jobs will not require a college degree of any kind. Today, 20.8% of all jobs require at least a bachelor's degree. In 2020, that's projected to go up to the grand sum of 21.7%. Meanwhile, today, about 69.1% of jobs require no more than a high school diploma. That will go down to 68.4%. Again, you shouldn't get scared by projections that the economy is radically changing its skill demands over the course of the next decade. There are trends. They are towards more low education jobs and more high education jobs, but overall they're not going to look that much different from the jobs that we have now in terms of their education requirements. Previous related work experience. Again, this is going to go down a tiny bit. The percentage of jobs that require no previous work experience goes up by a few tenths of a percentage point. The percentage that goes up that require less than a year of related work experience goes up by a tenth of a percentage point. The percentages that require a year or more go down a little bit. Again, the overwhelming majority of jobs require no previous related work experience. Similarly, for on-the-job training, most jobs require either no on-the-job training or just short-term on-the-job training, by which is meant less than a month of on-the-job training. The percentage of jobs that will require no on-the-job training is going to go up a little bit. The percentage that will require an internship or residency will go up a little bit. Otherwise, not a whole lot of change here. So now, to put a close to this part of the presentation and circle back to the issue of skill shortages, if we put together our job projections with our labor force projections in terms of education and education requirements, what do we find? Well, we find that for less than high school and high school, the percentage of workers who have that level of education is going to be lower than the percentage of jobs that would require it. Whereas for some college and above, the opposite is true. The percentage of jobs that require that level of education will be less than the percentage of workers who have that level of education. What does that mean? That means that workers are going to be facing more competition for jobs that require at least some college, which is just the opposite of the story about a skills shortage based on, at least in relation to higher education, that you usually hear. Now, does that mean that the world is going to get better for less educated workers? Well, not necessarily, because where do all those highly educated workers who can't get jobs in fields that require their levels of education go? Well, they get bumped down the ladder, and they end up competing with workers with less education for jobs that require less education. So if you graduate from UIC and you can't get a job as a planner, you may end up as a barista. So that is what we project for the next decade. No skill shortage in terms of education, just the opposite. In 1976, Harvard economist Richard Freeman published a book called The Overeducated American, in which he argued, and it's probably the last time you've ever heard anyone prominently arguing this, that Americans had too much education for the jobs that were available to them. Well, these projections suggest perhaps that we're going to see the overeducated Illinoisan in the future. However, a few caveats to this. First of all, of course, specific occupations and industries may differ. So that doesn't mean, just because there's no overall shortage of highly educated workers, doesn't mean that there might not be one for certain categories of work. Education matters in the long term for economic growth, even if the match between workers and jobs is not what we like it to be. Of course, education matters for non-economic reasons. It's not easy to convince others of this, which is why these arguments based on a skill shortage, or is one reason why these arguments based on skill shortages are popular with education advocates. And finally, important thing to remember about our projections, if we had faster economic growth, if we had a faster recovery than we're projecting, then there would be more jobs available for everyone, and labor force participation rates would rise, especially for less educated workers. When the economy is depressed or in a very, very slow recovery, some workers decide it isn't worth bothering to look for a job. They drop out of the labor force. That's especially true for less educated workers. When economic growth picks up, that goes in reverse. So you would see higher labor force participation rates for less educated workers, and this kind of imbalance that we showed on the previous slide either wouldn't exist or would be less severe than what we're seeing here. So, to bridge back to policy, if there's no evidence in the data for a skill shortage or shortage of highly educated workers, why do employers complain so vociferously that there is one? Well, one reason is the recession and the slow recovery, and to this I would even add the pretty anemic economic recovery that we had from the relatively shallow 2001 recession. The 2001 recession, for those who may remember, was nothing comparable to the one that we just experienced a few years ago, but we also didn't have a very robust recovery from it. Then we were hit, of course, with the recession that began in 2007, the Great Recession, and the extremely slow recovery. So for over a decade, we've had very, very sluggish overall job growth, and that's been an environment where wages haven't been going up, as we've been seeing. And wages haven't been going up in part because of that sluggish economic growth. When you have sluggish economic growth and not many jobs created, employers can be picky about who they hire. When there's more rapid growth, we're closer to full employment, employers can lower their skill demands, and they will have to lower their skill demands. So when employers say they can't find the workers they need, to some extent, that's relative to the state of the economy, because their needs are not just set by the technical requirements of jobs, they are the technical requirements of jobs combined with the state of the economy and employers' perceptions of what they think they can, who they think they can hire. So some of the skill shortage complaints from employers come from the fact that employers get pickier when they have more choices. And finally, this is especially an issue potentially in manufacturing, some employers just forget how to recruit workers when they haven't had to do it for a long time. And maybe this is less of a problem for a big organization that has an established HR department, but for a small or medium-sized company, small and medium-sized manufacturer here in Chicago, they don't hire anyone for a few years, and they just don't have anyone on staff who routinely does that kind of work, and they forget how to do it. They lose that competency. So these are all possible reasons why there may be, why employers may perceive skill shortages, possible reasons that are based on slow economic growth. There are also some other possible reasons that are based on long-term structural factors. One thing that we now know, based on the work of some economists from MIT and elsewhere, is that competition from low-wage countries keeps wages down, even in local service jobs. How can that be? It seems intuitive to many people that competition from low-wage countries will affect wages in manufacturing. How does it spill over to local service jobs? Well, that happens because as import competition reduces the number of manufacturing jobs, some of those people who used to work in manufacturing or who would otherwise work in manufacturing start to look for jobs in the local service sector. And that puts downward pressure on wages for those jobs as well. So that's one possible route by which you can have employers perceiving skill shortages, even though wages aren't going up as we would normally think that they would if there were skill shortages. Another possibility, and this is something that the recent MIT report on American manufacturing puts a lot of stock in, is the idea that there used to be a training system for middle-skilled jobs that require something more than a high school diploma, but less than even an associate degree. And that skill training system has broken down over the course of the last several decades, and basically almost no one has noticed it break down. Manufacturers have noticed the consequences of it. Other middle-skilled employers, to some extent, have too, but they haven't really identified why it has happened. One aspect of this is that there used to be a job pipeline from large to small firms. Large firms used to train workers, and then some of them would leave and work for smaller companies, and they would take their skills with them, obviously, when they did that. And many small firms got used to getting skilled workers through that path. That isn't happening so much anymore. Large companies are much less likely to do their own training now than they were a few decades ago, so the pipeline starts to dry up, and small firms suddenly don't get those skilled workers through that channel as they used to. Vocational schools. We used to have vocational schools. They didn't always have the best reputation, and that's partly why they declined. But that was another route by which there were entry-level workers for some of these middle-skill jobs, particularly in manufacturing, and in much of the country those hardly exist anymore. Apprenticeships. Apprenticeships have always been most common in unionized construction, but they also have existed in manufacturing and to some extent in some other middle-skill jobs. Their institutional forms have been very different in those jobs than it's been in construction. Basically, outside of unionized construction, there are hardly any apprenticeships anymore. So that's another channel, other than formal education for developing skills, that we don't really have much of anymore. Back a few decades ago, workers used to learn a lot about jobs, both cognitively and non-cognitively, through their own families and friends and neighborhoods. There used to be in northeastern and midwestern cities in this country, there used to be extensive informal ties between neighborhoods, generally white ethnic working class neighborhoods, and particular employers or particular subsets of jobs within those employers. Those jobs were more or less passed on from one person to another, if not overtly, then just through a system of referrals. Employers were happy with the workers they got through those channels. Nobody was pressing them to do anything else, so they hired the workers who were referred to them by their current workforce. That was the way a lot of people got jobs, especially men in white ethnic working class neighborhoods. I wrote my dissertation on this in Boston almost 3 decades ago. This system has been disrupted, if not eliminated, in most of the cities that where it used to function. There are many reasons for this. If you want to draw some connections between issues that you're more likely to encounter as planners and some of these workforce issues, you could even hypothesize a link between gentrification and the disruption of these kinds of ties. So that's another aspect of the skill development system that doesn't exist anymore. So the result of all of these things together potentially is that you have a skill development system that is broken down for these middle skill jobs. And that's why employers are complaining about job shortages. Again, these are all hypotheses. There's some degree of support for each of the pieces of them. There's been no, and this is still a fertile area for research as to why there are these perceptions of skill shortage, particularly in manufacturing, but not only in manufacturing. So, in view of all that, what can we say about workforce training policy? Well, I want to say a very, very brief overview, the 50,000-foot view of federal workforce training policy, talk about some recent innovations and proposed innovations, and then say a bit about what should be done. In general, I want to suggest that the developments that we just mentioned suggest that federal workforce training policy and its state analogs are not responding very well to the challenges of today's economy. They were developed for earlier times, and they have not really been updated. Recent innovations and proposals, some have some promise in responding to some of the more recent challenges, and some don't. And what should be done? Well, that's the punchline. So here's the 50,000-foot overview of federal workforce training policy. Federal workforce training policy basically started in 1962 with the passage of the Manpower Development and Training Act at the federal level. Policy has gone through a number of iterations and been embodied in a number of different federal laws that have changed pretty substantially about every 10 to 15 years. The current omnibus workforce training law at the federal level is called the Workforce Innovation Act, and was passed in 1998 to generalize over broadly about the system that has been created by all these laws. Over this whole period since the early 60s, when the system started, it has overwhelmingly emphasized short-term job training, usually meaning less than a month of training, almost always meaning less than a year. The emphasis has always been on quick job placement, and that's been particularly true since the Workforce Innovation Act was passed in the late 1990s, shortly after welfare reform. And the policy emphasis at that time at the federal level was work first, get people off of welfare and get them into any job. And that, while that philosophy was overtly applied to people coming off of public assistance, it carried over into other areas too. So this the same kind of orientation applied to people who were displaced from jobs or new labor force entrants, for example. What this means is that we have never had a system like the one that exists in Denmark, where people can be eligible for public subsidies for very long-term training, even up to 3 or 4 years. And although that's gotten cut back a little bit in the last couple of years, even in Denmark, it's still much, much greater than anything that we've ever had in this country. Training policy has always been aimed at specific populations that were deemed to be, by policymakers, to be at risk in some way. The major ones were youth, long-term unemployed, and displaced workers. And there are separate streams of funding with different separate requirements that apply to each of these groups and to other smaller groups that I haven't listed. The lack of integration of these streams of funding has been the bane of workforce training advocates for ages. And it is always the topic of proposed reforms, but nothing ever happens. The training system has never been well integrated with formal education. These are two different worlds. Workforce training money, for the most part, doesn't go to pay for formal education. That's partly because it is short-term training money. In the early days, in the 60s and 70s, training was either delivered directly by the public sector, or the government agency would contract with particular providers to provide particular kinds of training that the government agency would decide on. Over time, starting in the 1980s, and even more so with the Workforce Investment Act, there's been a shift from this government delivery of training or contracting for training to the idea that there's a training market out there that the government just needs to coordinate in some way. So now governments don't decide that there are going to be particular kinds of training that are going to be done, and they don't pick particular contractors to do those kinds of training. Instead, there's this whole smorgasbord, this whole marketplace out there, and training dollars are available to any provider that provides a wide range of services. The idea is that workers who are out there looking for training are like customers in this market, and they can, if they're well informed, then they can make good decisions about the kinds of training that they need. That's the theory. In the early days of federal job training, the idea was that the job seeker was the customer of the workforce development system. Over time, that has shifted somewhat. So increasingly, policymakers now see businesses as the customers of the training system. This shift was prompted in part by complaints that federal training money was used to support training for jobs that don't exist. So if that is true, then involving employers more in the determination of what kinds of training would be provided presumably would help to solve that problem, although it doesn't solve other problems, like employers having a very short-term orientation towards training needs, or employers in the face of sluggish labor markets wanting to create surpluses of available workers so that they can be picky. Geographic decentralization, some degree of administration of the system at state and local levels has always been a characteristic of our system, and that has become even more characteristic since Workforce Investment Act. And state-funded training, states have their own rules for these things, but they have generally followed the federal pattern, again, at the 50,000-foot level. So in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been various proposals and various innovations that have actually been adopted, mostly at the state and local level in the training system. The first one is one that's never really been embodied anywhere. It's the idea of a dual customer approach, that somehow the training system should try to equally serve both workers and employers. That was a common recommendation coming out of the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Annie Casey Foundation, other major foundations in the early part of the 21st century that funded a lot of research and policy experimentation on job training, never really got embodied in federal or state policy. Customized job training. Customized job training doesn't mean customized for the worker, it means customized for the employer. It means funding training for the benefit of a particular employer, customized and tailored to that particular employer's needs. The pioneers of this approach to job training were southern states that were trying to attract large manufacturers but didn't have good education or training systems themselves. They would offer, as an inducement to large manufacturers to locate in their states or localities, they would offer additional funding to community colleges or other providers to provide exactly the kind of training that a particular employer said that it wanted. And not very good for the long-term interests of either workers or employers, just very, very oriented toward the short-term interests of particular employers. There's been a lot of experimentation recently with expanded roles for community colleges in the training system. Employer-funded training has become a really important source of activity and revenue for many community colleges. As community colleges had problems funding their regular associate degree programs as a result of state and local funding cutbacks, they increasingly turned to employers who were happy to fund customized or near customized job training programs for their employees or potential employees at the colleges. And the colleges set up these programs generally as a completely separate system with separate faculties, separate funding streams from their regular academic programs, which creates a lot of tension in community colleges. Academic credit for vocational programs is something that we've seen some experimentation with as well. Industry workforce partnerships. The idea behind industry workforce partnerships is that a group of employers, generally in the same or related industries in a metropolitan area or other small geographic area, generally have a set of common workforce needs. And if you can only get them together to figure out what those needs were and make some federal or state money, generally state money, because you can't do this at the federal level yet, you make some federal money or some state money available to them, then they can work out those needs and figure out how to solve them. In the absence of that, individual employers won't invest enough in training because every employer will be afraid that some other employer is going to poach away the workers that it trains. So industry workforce partnerships are conceived as a solution to that kind of problem. Pennsylvania pioneered this approach back when I was there when Howard Wial was governor. It was, as far as we could tell from its first couple of years, a successful approach, but then of course the gubernatorial administration changed and all the funding dried up. Other states have tried to copy this approach. Illinois is experimenting with this approach right now in manufacturing. There's supposed to be an evaluation of that effort in about 3 years from now. So we'll see how that works. Final new experiment has been with so-called upside-down college degrees integrated with apprenticeships. Normally you think most college programs are set up on the assumption that you go from the general to the specific, that you start off taking some general overview courses where you learn a little bit about a lot of things in an academic discipline, and then you narrow down and become more specialized as you go on in the program. The upside-down degree is based on the opposite philosophy, that you start with something very, very concrete and applied, such as an apprenticeship in a particular kind of trade, a building trade or even in manufacturing, and then you build out from that. After a worker has had an apprenticeship, which integrates work and learning in a pretty narrow kind of occupation, then the worker can get some college credit for that, and then if he or she wants, the worker can go on and eventually build out a bachelor's degree by taking the more general kinds of courses. the courses that we normally at a school like this offer to students in their first and second undergraduate years. Those come later in this kind of upside-down system, and it is meant to take advantage of the preference of many kinds of workers for this mode of learning rather than for the reverse, and also to make college degrees more financially accessible and more integrated with manufacturing and other kinds of non-college requiring fields, so that workers don't feel that they have to choose once and for all either a high-paying career at college or no college and be consigned to a series of low-paying jobs. So, in general, what does this all add up to in terms of what should be done? Well, I think the first thing you have to do is get the background factors right. This is all the things that have nothing to do directly with workforce training policy, but have a whole lot of impact on how many jobs and what kinds of jobs are going to be available, what unemployment rates will be, what wages will be. You need full employment, whether you get to that through maintaining government spending, which doesn't seem super likely right now. Monetary policy, which the Fed has done something towards. A government jobs program, which we don't seem to have any political appetite for in this country. Some combination of these things. We have to get back toward full employment. Otherwise, we're still going to have those problems that you saw in the first few data slides. As far as trade goes, this is also basically federal policy. Whatever trade agreements we have should not encourage offshoring, particularly at a time when offshoring is going to be less of a problem. Otherwise, we don't need trade agreements to pile on top of it and make it more of a problem. And then we need to raise wages, indirectly or directly, for low and middle wage workers. And that means support for unionization, means raising the minimum wage regularly and robustly. And these minimum wage is a pretty politically popular policy, and well, we never raise it as much as we should. That is something I'd expect to see. Support for unionization, at least publicly, I don't know. We're not seeing any movement at the federal level, but there are some interesting things happening locally. I think we should expand industry partnerships. I think they were a promising approach. They would be even more of a promising approach the more they can be expanded to include not only employers in industry, but also other organizations that have some interest in it, like unions and community organizations, local governments, and even universities. An example of that we're working on right now at QED is the new app for Making It in America in Pittsburgh. This is an experimental program funded by the Department of Labor for 3 years, which seeks to bring together Carnegie Mellon University and the small startup companies that have spun off from it, and the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO to create a modernized 21st century high-tech apprenticeship program for those small companies or for the contract manufacturers that are doing a lot of their manufacturing. The idea is to create a new training system for this emerging high-tech area of manufacturing. And so you can basically think of that as an expanded industry partnership. We also need to continue to push on those kinds of reforms that reduce barriers between training and formal education, so that we don't have this current bifurcation that many people perceive between either college and good jobs or no college and bad jobs. And perhaps the only silver lining to the declining wages of college graduates is that perhaps that will make this more possible as more and more people see that a college degree is not a guarantee of a good job. So there are a variety of forms this can take. One is modernized vocational high schools. In a week or two, you'll be hearing about Austin Polytechnic. This is an independent public high school in the Chicago public school system that was created by the Chicago Manufacturing Renaissance Council about 5 years ago, I think. And it is not just a vocational school, it's a general high school that has the general curriculum of other high schools in the Chicago public system, but it has a state-of-the-art manufacturing lab with all of the most up-to-date machines, and it takes a very, very broad view of what manufacturing is. It tries to integrate manufacturing in the broadest sense into other aspects of the curriculum. So English teachers and social studies teachers and science teachers are encouraged to work manufacturing into their curricula in some way. And the school's view is that it's not just training production workers, but it's training people to support the whole manufacturing ecosystem, including engineers, patent lawyers, and other people who do support that ecosystem in their work, but aren't necessarily working on the shop floor, as well as people, of course, who are working on the shop floor. Upside down degrees are integrated with apprenticeships. We talked about that briefly. That seems like a promising trend also, and we need to pay for longer term training through our support for training programs. So that's where I think we should be going. It's pretty far in most respects from where we have been going.
Okay, great. You've given us the grist for a lot of conversation now. So we have time for questions and comments. Go ahead, Julie.
Actually, I could have a long conversation about it. But I love the way you did your data. I think, you know, and not that many people in workforce development do it in quite that way. So it's really interesting. But there was one thing there that just is completely different than everybody else's projections.
Which one?
And that's the rise of middle skill jobs. I mean, everyone's talking about that, and that's the job that requires some post-secondary education, but not necessarily a BA.
Yeah.
And that those have pretty good wages, you know.
Yeah.
And, well, wait, because I have some other questions.
Okay.
So, and those are sort of the technician type of jobs, whether it's in healthcare, or manufacturing, you know, even sort of the financial services industry, et cetera. So anyway, so that's one question. And I'm not a data person, so I can't, you know, dive into that, but I'd love to get copies of your slides for the rest. But then then your conclusion, which of course was depressing, like you've got sort of growth in jobs at both ends and not this middle skill job. And you said, well, it seems like the shortage of jobs is kind of, or shortage of skilled labor is kind of a perception and not a reality, and maybe if they raised wages, that would probably end it. But a lot of your conclusions, which I kind of agree with, are around increasing the pipeline. So for these jobs, like a lot of them middle skill jobs. So I'm just sort of confused.
Okay, middle skill jobs, yeah. A lot of jobs are middle skill jobs. What we're showing here in these projections are just, you know, what is projected to happen to the overall shares of jobs that are in each category. It doesn't mean that there won't still be a lot of middle skill jobs, or even that middle skill jobs will continue to be, perhaps, you know, by some reckoning, the largest share of the total. So that's still consistent.
So you didn't do that calculation?
Yeah, we didn't do that
Share of
calculation.
these jobs in the economy?
Yeah, we didn't.
Okay.
We didn't do that.
Okay.
We also, some of the middle school jobs are going to be found in that high school only category, because they don't require a college degree, or even an associate degree. So to some extent, they're masked in the data. This is one of the problems of using these data to deal with middle school job markets. Also, this doesn't say anything about the flow of jobs, the number of openings that there are going to be. It just tells you how many jobs there are going to be, whether they're occupied by people who've been there 20 years or whether there are going to be a lot of openings tomorrow. We're not saying that. Middle skill jobs were disproportionately occupied by people high turnover, or we're older, or we're going to retire, then you could see a lot more openings in those areas than would be suggested by these sorts of data. So this is not an anti-middle skill job presentation. As far as perceptions of shortages compared with these sorts of structural policy recommendations, I don't think there is evidence for widespread shortages that show up in the data, but I do think there is evidence that the skill development system is not working as well as it used to. And I want to separate those two things out. I am not anti-workforce development policy, but I want to encourage workforce development policy advocates not to jump to the easy argumentative route, saying, well, the way we can justify the kinds of policies that would be good for the economy and good for workers is by jumping on the skill shortage bandwagon with employers. If you jump on that bandwagon, you run the risk of just supporting the creation of more and more skilled workers, or then there will be a need for jobs. You really need to work the skill development system in tandem with the job creation system. Otherwise, you end up creating surpluses of skilled workers, and many employers would be perfectly happy to see that happen. And that's perhaps a hidden agenda behind their complaints about skill shortages. But I don't think we need to go that way.
In addition to examples like the New App program and Austin Polytech, Nick, what in Illinois, what kind of programs are currently kind of tying the workforce development training or toward, training and education, tying that to kind of the jobs outlook and jobs perspective, like the changing nature of jobs?
There's not a huge amount. The City Colleges of Chicago reorganized their whole structure to try to relocate certain kinds of programs in particular colleges rather than having them spread out throughout the whole system. So, for example, in manufacturing, most of the manufacturing programs are now at Richard Daley College on the far south side, and they actually hired someone to coordinate those who knows the paint comes out of the manufacturing world and knows a lot about them. If they did that in other areas that I'm less well plugged into, that's a promising development on their part. The Chicagoland Workforce Funders Alliance, which is a consortium of some of the major foundations in the area that fund workforce training, policy, and research, just gave an award, or is in the process of giving an award to the Illinois Manufacturing Excellence Center, which along with several other partners is proposing to create a manufacturing industry workforce partnership in this area, which is going to supposedly try to operate on the same principles that IMEC uses when it helps individual companies with their production problems. So they're going to try to bring them together and get them to systematically try to figure out what are the root causes of their perceived skill shortages. And if they do this in a sensible way, we may learn a lot from it. And the programs that come out of this may be ones that can be more generally applicable. So those are a couple things that seem promising that are on the horizon. But, this is a big metropolitan area. It's not one that has been a hotbed of innovation in this area, and we'll just have to see if a couple of these innovations shows promise, maybe they'll spread. If there are innovations in other areas, like the new app in Pittsburgh, that show promise, maybe they'll get picked up in places like this. I don't think Chicago is unique in this way at all. I think this is true in general in very, very large metropolitan areas. They develop these very, very large, fragmented, not very effective workforce development systems. as well as systems for dealing with other kinds of economic problems, and it's just hard to get them to work well. In places like Pittsburgh, you can experiment more easily.
Well, I was glad to see you focus too on the issue of training on the part of the corporations or part of the businesses, the manufacturers, and you suggested a number of reasons why they don't do it anymore, or why they stopped doing it. Right?
Yeah.
And I think one of those things that was not on their list is they just decided they didn't want to bear the cost of doing it. And yet, it seems, so I like what you said about that, I like your recommendations with respect to that. But so I'd like to hear you speak a little bit more about what it would take to get these employers to invest more in the training, because they in some ways are in the best position to hook up the skill development with the job creation, that they know what they need to.
Yeah.
Is it an issue of is it an issue of will? Is it an issue of capacity building on their part? Is it an issue of we don't really want to have to hire too many employees, and so we'll leave it to somebody else to train them and then say, well, we can't hire because they're not skilled? I mean, if you could just speak a little bit more to that and their responsibility.
Yeah, so when employers used to find it valuable to have long-term employment relationships for at least a large part of their workforce, then it was worthwhile for them to train those workers. And have a lot of that training be idiosyncratic to their particular company, because they know those workers would stick around for a long time and the investment would pay off. When that broke down, then training also broke down. When employers were able to maintain that previous system of long-term job relationships, in part because part of the workforce was excluded from those, so they could offer that to a core set of workers, and you could other workers could be kept out of it. There were not enough jobs available in that core part of the workforce for everybody. And in part because demand was pretty stable for a lot of the company's products from the 1940s, the 1970s, even into the early 1980s. So when you have stable product demand, you can have stable employment. And you have stable employment, you can start planning for long-term relationships between workers and employers and create these internal training systems. If you could think of how to reconstruct that world, then you would solve this problem, but you wouldn't solve the problem of there not being enough jobs for everyone. And as the pressures, the body of the civil rights movement and all of its successors for getting excluded workers into that system grew, employers could not meet those demands. I suppose they could have excluded everyone on an equal opportunity basis, but that didn't happen because the number of core stable jobs itself was declining. So I think, what would you need to create a system, anything like that? You would need to stabilize product demand in a way that seems very hard to imagine that we can get back to. And even if we could get back to it, we still wouldn't create enough jobs.
Well, and also just kind of.
So then what we have to think of is, how can we recreate a training system in a world where jobs are not going to be so stable? Well, there are examples of this that we can look toward. The new app is very heavily influenced by the construction industry. In fact, one of the major unions that's involved in it is the sheet metal workers, which is largely a construction union that has some activity in manufacturing also. And the way that construction unions deal with this is that they bargain with employers over training. And employers, as part of the collective bargaining agreement, have to contribute. They all have to contribute a certain amount of money based on the number of work hours that they have to the training fund. The training fund is jointly administered by the union and the employers, and there is an area-wide rather than a company-wide collectively bargained pay system. That's the kind of system, that's an example of the kind of system that would make it possible to have good jobs and the training that supports good jobs, even in a world where jobs are unstable. And that's, there have been other examples of that over time. They have all involved bringing employers, multiple employers in an industry together. They have all involved some degree of mutual pressure on employers to stay in the system. They will involve some kind of outside pressure on employers to stay in the system, whether that pressure came from government or from unions. They have all involved broad, area-wide pay-setting systems rather than company-specific ones. So I think that those are generally the directions that we need to move in.
Yeah, because I was just thinking too about a lot of times in the economic development policies, when cities or municipalities or other jurisdictions are trying to draw in appropriations, a lot of times they won't put it on them the responsibility to train, but the governments will train, will provide all the money for the training. So it isn't that shared.
Yeah, and that's why this movement, which started in the South toward customized state governments funding customized job training, is exactly the wrong way to go.
Well, I appreciate your excellent presentation. However, I would like to see how do you articulate your presentation on the workforce on the federal basis with the planning, the institutions devoted to planning, such as Chicago Metropolis 2020 and yesterday's presentation on this agency on 2040, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning 2040. And also even like this study I have over here, Metro Chicago Economic Development Partnership. And even coming down to a practical basis to spot areas where maybe the workforce could have an excellent opportunity to be occupied, such as tourism. Chicago received 43.6 million of tourists last year. So the idea is how to articulate, not to be separate, but to be a part of this planning for Metro Chicago, let's say, for the area of Metro Chicago, not on the federal base, but Metro Chicago. The role your presentation could apport ideas and could be a good input for this planning, say the coordination.
Yeah, I think this gets down, even though this is a pretty broad brush overview, workforce development is probably much more detailed than anything you're going to see in these region-wide plans, which, if they talk about schools, they sort of express general support for education and training at all levels. So this could be seen as maybe a step or two down from that. The big plans tend to be relatively agnostic about occupations or industries. For example, the Plan for Economic Growth and Jobs, which we have used an awful lot in our work in manufacturing, has a plank that pertains to pretty much every major industry in metropolitan Chicago. It doesn't try to engage in local industrial policy to favor the higher paying sectors, or the ones that are more likely to grow, or the ones that are higher productivity, or the ones that are more innovative, or the ones that are less likely to leave the area. It doesn't prioritize those over anything else. And that probably reflects the politics of local planning more than anything else. At some point, those sorts of choices have to be made, just because training resources, like everything else, are limited. I think you should be putting your training dollars to in the places where they will create more good jobs for local residents. But not everybody sees it that way. The tourism industry is especially problematic because it's generally a low-paying industry. It does have some high-paying jobs. There are some specific workforce problems even within the industry as it's currently set up. They basically have to do with who gets access to the relatively high-paying jobs that exist within the industry. There's basically a front of the house and a back of the house in hotels, and the front of the house jobs, which are which start out with the front desk jobs, the other kinds of clerical and administrative and customer contact jobs, are the ones that have better career ladders and lead on to hotel management, whereas the back of the house jobs, the housekeepers and the cooks and the dishwashers, those are in most cases largely dead-end jobs, and in unionized hotels those are better than in places where they're not, but the structure is really a whole lot different.
But it's an impact in the economy anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we worked you hard this afternoon. Thank you so much, Howard. I really
Sure.
appreciate it.